Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Bloomberg Law webinar. At this time, all lines are in a listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for questions following the presentation. Please submit your substantive questions via the Q&A tab and technical support questions on the Tech Support tab on the right side of your screen. To access the PowerPoints or other files associated with this webinar, please click on the resources link listed in your upcoming webinars or recent registrations on your dashboard. If you wish to receive credit for this webinar, please make sure to respond to the presence check codes popping up on your screen throughout the program. You will need to respond to the majority of these codes in order to receive credit. Please fill out the webinar evaluation survey as well as confirm your certificate information at the end of the webinar. Your certificates will then be emailed to you. If you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email us at credits@bna.com. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to thank Workday for sponsoring today's webinar. A leading provider of enterprise cloud applications, Workday delivers financial management, human capital management, and analytics applications designed for the world's latest organizations. I'd now like to introduce the speakers for today's webinar, Achieving Operational Excellence in Professional Services Organizations, Remaining Competitive and Driving Profitable Growth. Patrice Capello is the Strategic Industry Advisor for Professional and Business Services at Workday. Patrice brings more than 25 years of experience bringing technology to firms to achieve objectives, overcome challenges, and most importantly, drive business value. Patrice has experience within multiple industry verticals with a specific focus on the professional and business services industry for 20 years. Deborah Deffer is the Managing Director for Business Services and Outsourcing at BDO. Deborah has more than 30 years of accounting experience. She is the technology lead for the platform as it relates to QuickBooks Online, along with the multitude of third-party applications. She focuses on QuickBooks administration, receivables/payables, payroll setup and processing, financial reports, business workflows, and both corporate and individual tax returns. Thomas Schrader is the Director of Global Product Strategy Lead Financials within Alight Solutions Cloud Deployment Solutions HR and Financial Solutions Consulting Practice, and he manages their Global Workday Financials Implementation Practice. Thomas has the responsibility to manage over 100 consultants that are dedicated to Alight Solutions Cloud Financials Implementation Practice. In today's program, we will discuss some of the key challenges faced by professional services organizations today and strategies for overcoming these challenges. We'll take a deeper dive into the following challenges with our panelists: complexities, demographics and change management, the importance of specialization, the impact of automation and technology, and the competitive landscape today. Complexities come up for a variety of reasons for professional services organizations. Patrice, could you talk about some of the complexities that are specific to different sized organizations?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Jima. By its very nature, professional services firms are pretty complex. If you're really on the outside looking in to the industry, you might think it's a fairly straightforward business proposition in that you sell your services, you deliver them, and you bill your clients for them. But what we really see is that due to a number of different factors, firms are really complex regardless of size. And part of what drives the complexity is really clients are more demanding than ever before. They expect the service delivery provider to take on some of the risk in the arrangement. So what that does is it's driving much more complex pricing and contracts between the provider and the procurer of those services. So that can drive complexity in the firm regardless of how big or small a firm is. And we're also seeing that globalization really creates a lot of complexities in firms as well. So if we think about, we've seen a lot of firms, again, irrespective of size, go global over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's for a couple of different reasons. I mean, one is firms are nearshoring and offshoring some of their services so that they can deliver them in a more cost-effective manner and pass that savings on to the client. And then also firms are going global because they're going where their clients are, and many of their clients are global. So again, when you kind of introduce this concept of globalization within your firm, that also creates a lot of complexity on the internal business processes and running of the firm. And then we also see that people are changing, right? And we all acknowledge this, that workforce demands are much different than they used to be in the past. So their expectations are very high, and the firm needs to be able to really create that culture of engagement and provide the tools that our resources need to do their jobs every day. So really, I would say all of these things are happening and causing change in the service delivery world. And that is what's really creating a lot of the complexities within the professional services firms. Certainly, the larger a firm becomes, things become more challenging. It puts strain on some of the business processes and perhaps some of the technology that firms have. And so firms, really need to be able to look at through growth, how do we manage that in a way where we're not growing costs as we're growing the firm together, so that it's a more profitable growth strategy. So I would say kind of all of those things are happening externally, putting pressure on firms and really causing that complexity inside any size professional services firm.
Thanks, Patrice. Now, on top of the company size, you talked about a few other factors. Deborah, could you talk about people strategy and delivery strategy and how those can lead to complexities in the industry?
Absolutely. So I'll tell you, I agree with everything that Patrice said, and then just to compound it, when you start looking at, your workforce itself and the people, we have, our baby boomers and Generation X and now the millennials and then the next generation to come. And all of these different generations have different perceptions of how they want their whole work environment to operate. And many times they don't align with each other. So it's super important to be able to be nimble and flexible with people, having great training programs, having really good succession planning in place. We're seeing a lot of firms do acquisitions now, and that in itself, adds more complexity to it because you have different people, and you try to make sure it's the same culture when you do acquisitions. But then that falls into the whole delivery, right, of the products when you're doing acquisitions as well, because you can be using different pieces of technology, and you need to standardize those pieces of technology and standardize your workflow processes so that, ultimately what it comes down to is the client experience. So, on top of just the globalization, the company size, understanding people. And it's incredible to know, even in the delivery side of it, there's hundreds of thousands of applications that you can leverage, and picking which one's best for your business, your organization is critical to overcoming some of those things.
Great, thanks, Deborah. Thomas, could you speak to how accounting strategy kind of leads to complexities? And I think that ties nicely into maybe talking a little bit about understanding your assets.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think about accounting strategy and professional services. One of the things that I see us internally, as well as a lot of organizations struggle with, is defining where revenue flows. So depending on your interpretation, so perspective, in the intro, I run a team of about 100, but we fit into a global population of about 22,000 individuals that are working on a variety of projects across the world. So when you think about a global project, Patrice was mentioning the kind of competitive landscape, and we're always trying to ensure that we're giving the best value at the best cost to our customers. And obviously we need to do that to stay competitive in the market. And one of the things we run into is when you get this global team, a lot of the complexity from an accounting perspective starts getting into where's the revenue flowing, right? If I have 5 or 6 different individuals sitting in different regional P&Ls, you run into a lot of the issues associated with transfer pricing. And, I like to think that data is king here in the analysis to ensure that, if you have one region that you're contracting out of, does that mean all the revenue flows there? Not necessarily, right? You might have the understanding or the opinion that the revenue should follow the worker that's doing the work, but I think the kind of collective organizational goal can add a lot of clarity to that. I know for us and for other organizations, there can be a lot of struggle around, if you're contracting in one region, where does the revenue flow with resources that are actually delivering the services in that contract? And I think the kind of data analysis and having the full visibility on all these workers that are working on a typical project helps a lot in some of the complexities associated with accounting. And then I'll jump into the asset piece as well. I think, when I think about assets for us and for other professional services firms, you're thinking about your employees, right? And there's, the data being king being an exact kind of qualifier here as well is when I think about delivering value to clients, it's all associated with putting the best resource based on what the client is asking us for, and having the visibility to understand your resources, what their skill set, what their capabilities are, allows you to shift those resources around and actually staff them on projects to deliver a lot of that value. But the challenge comes into there's kind of the paper designation of maybe a skill set or a degree or a competency within a particular programming language or, historical kind of resume related experience. But then when you get into kind of that high performers, low performers, the ability to have insight and understand the resources, capabilities as it relates to their performance and development plan is one of the most important things that I look at in my business to ensure that I have not only the right resources, but I also am engaging those assets to understand what they're looking for as it relates to development. Because the way I look at it with the resources, the happier the resources are working for your organizations, the better service they're going to be giving to external clients. So, there's a little bit of that, hand-in-hand comparison of how do you give the best service and value to your customers, and a lot of that is back to, the status and the engagement of those employees, and having a good understanding of what they're looking for within an organization, as well as placing them in the best spot, is very important, because everybody likes to do well. And having someone in the wrong position can be as simple as kind of a misalignment of expectations between a manager or a project manager and that resource itself.
All right, let's talk a bit about demographics and change management. You all kind of touched on the changes that are happening in today's workforce. Deborah, what kind of changes are you seeing around the demographics of today's workforce, and how is that impacting the professional services industry specifically?
Yeah, so some things are like just really jump out at you with statistics and stuff, like the ability to work remotely with the millennial workforce. 61% work remotely, at least part-time. And they want that flexibility of that work-life balance and family within that. And so in a professional service organization, you're a people person, right? We need that communication and that interaction with our clients and with other individuals in our offices. So, utilizing technology like WebExes and Skype and many of those products, Join Me, that in order to connect, even if you're not physically there. From a financial perspective, it's really beneficial, actually, when you can, have these professionals that work remotely, as you can cut back on your square footage of office space in any given, location or proximity, because not everybody's going to be in the office at the same time. You don't need as many workstations or offices. So, from a financial perspective, that can be, significantly beneficial. But the other piece of it, especially with the millennial workforce, and that's who's coming up, right? That's who's going to be partners in the public accounting arena in, the next 10 to 12 years. There's a lot of partners retiring in public accounting. I can't remember the exact percentage over the next 5 years, but it's a lot. And if we don't start, promoting and getting partner buy-in, we can't build our practice, right? The accounting profession, it's not going to be able to be successful. That's why we're seeing these acquisitions and stuff come through as well. So some of the other things that jump out at you, 60% of the millennials jump jobs. They'll have 4 jobs by the time they're 32 years old, and 21% of that have gotten a new job just in the last year. So those are things that are like really important to think about as you're doing your hiring, and understanding that the older workforce, if they don't embrace the technology and the changes that's being offered by the younger piece of the workforce, you get a real big disconnect. So change management's in there too as well.
Thanks, Deborah. So I want to circle back a little bit to that change management that you were talking about, the partners that are transitioning towards retirement. So we've just talked about the millennials. So what about that other part of the workforce? How should professional services companies be kind of handling this change management?
So it's really important to have very specific processes laid out in order for everybody to understand. And part of the process is communication. So it's how are you delivering the message to your team? How are you delivering the information that says, okay, we're going to move from point A to point B, and we're standardizing our processes, and our service delivery model is going to look like X, Y, and Z, and then sharing that information, and then getting the buy-in of other partners and also your team members. So, having it documented, having specific reasons why it's a benefit to make those changes, and then being able to show economically what the benefits are producing for you. But I'm always, falling back to it's all about that communication and of the processes that's being laid out. Because without that piece of it, if you have all these mixed messages, you're not going to transition and change the workforce to shift. One of the things that we see in the public accounting space is the fact that you'll start seeing some trigger words called pre-accounting. Technology is going to aid us. It's not a matter of, eliminating us. It's a matter of taming the machines, understanding what is being available to us, utilizing it to make us more efficient with some automation, and then the end result is a good client experience. And we've been profitable because we're able to have better productivity and realization based on leveraging pieces of technology. So it's all of those things combined that have to happen, right, in order to be successful.
Thomas, could you talk a little bit more specifically to how leaders should be investing in training programs for the workforce that's transitioning, and where they should be thinking about investing in transformation and these training programs?
So, I always take a book out of kind of a sales strategy whenever I think about where you want to invest in training, that sort of thing. It is really understanding the different audiences, right? So if you think about a sales exec, right, whatever they're selling, if they're selling a car, if they're selling a contract for accounting or a deployment of whatever software, there's the concept of selling to the buyer. And that's the exact same way that I look at training, is really understanding your population and understanding the different ways that your organization and those employees actually consume that training. I think Deborah got some really good points about the transitioning of workforce, where there's a lot of the millennial and now getting into the Generation Z, right, of the different individuals that consume information in a much different fashion. I think there's also the coupling of the concept around, the brick and mortar establishment slowly deteriorating, right? The investment in telecommuting, the ability to the remote workforce takes away from what traditionally would have been much more classroom style driven or train the trainer type training programs that organizations were investing a lot of money in. But I would always recommend anybody looking at any sort of training programs is get an understanding of how your organization works, how your organization consumes that information as a starting point. But it is also meeting that employee population, where they go to get information and how they consume it. So what I would say now, prevalently, seen a lot more, transitioning to, the mobile, whether it's, over the internet through a desktop, laptop, or straight to your smartphone. There's a lot of that kind of training programs that organizations are investing in, and I would say even specifically more, instead of thinking about a training program that focuses on a 4-hour video or something of that nature, you're going to think a little bit more about kind of the quick hitting concept, right? So if you think about the way that the millennials and Generation Z processes information, it's very much associated with kind of jumping around, right? Deborah gave some great statistics about resources that change jobs and want to do a lot of different things. So it's not that it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just that concept of being able to get that information quickly, right? There's a generation that grew up with the internet and has the understanding and is accustomed to just getting whatever they need quickly. So a lot of organizations are talking about process flow type training. So I completely agree with Deborah's point, again, just associated with establishing those processes. And if you think about that concept and being able to drill into a quick YouTube-like video experience or a Snapchat, right? If you think about the way a lot of organizations or employees, are processing information, those sort of training programs have been very successful to give those individuals that information quickly at their fingertips, as opposed to what they seem as a monotonous, sitting in a classroom, that sort of thing, as it relates to processing those training. When you think about just the transformational component of it, Deborah made a great point about, machine learning, kind of the robotics. I know in on the accounting side as well as on the HR side, when you think about kind of the back office support, there's a big push in automation, and it is really truly to eliminate redundancy. So I agree with the point that was made around robots, whether it's thinking about robotics process automation within processing, or thinking about artificial intelligence or machine learning as it relates to things like reporting and analytics. Those sort of things are exactly that, an enabler, not a replacement to your employees. So a lot of organizations are looking at transforming their processes and training those employees to think as opposed to process by a script. So instead of telling the employees follow step A and then follow step B, it's putting them in key decision-making points within that process. So instead of I'm just filling out boxes and passing on to the next person, right? Machines, machine learning, robots, et cetera, they can do that, right? If you think about when was the last time you called in to get customer service and you talked to an employee right away, right? It's all associated with filling out 3 or 4 different pieces of information to get to that right person who then can help you and serve you. So think about professional service, it's still that concept. If I can enable my workforce to process or do a certain task, instead of doing 1 in a day, I can have them do 5 in a day. That obviously makes me more efficient, which helps me win and make more business for my organization based on contracts, and also gives a better client experience and cost reduction out to the clients that I serve. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that continue as individuals are looking at where and how logical evaluations can be built in. But I think the key point here is really transforming your organization to think as opposed to just following a rigid set of sequential processes.
Great, thanks. Let's talk about specialization. Many companies want to reach a very broad customer database, but this can be a pretty big challenge. Deborah, why should professional services firms look to specialize, and how do they make sure that they're doing so effectively?
So if you look at other industries, healthcare, law practices, they started specializing much sooner than we are in the accounting or professional services space. And it's, you can know a little bit about everything, but if you want to really be that expert, selecting a specialization is critical to doing that. And we've seen it. We at BDO, we are very diligent about picking and very specific about picking what industries that we focus on, and they can change too. To keep that in mind is that it's the industries that you're really focused on in the next 2 or 3 years. Maybe one of those falls off, and you add another one. So you have to be able to recognize where the needs are in a given location, where offices reside, what's happening in the world. And so by specializing, you become an expert in that area to client-facing, and that brings so much value. Instead of just being a generalist, you can bring a lot more to the table for your clients. It's really effective, and it makes it just makes for a more positive outcome, in my opinion, with clients as we go down that path, and it just brings more to the table.
Patrice, could you speak to how these types of companies should be developing specialized business plans?
Sure. So I very much agree with what Deborah was saying. I mean, I think specialization is key to being successful in this industry. And why that's so important is your customers, when they select service providers, they want the comfort level that you understand their business. That is first and foremost, what that service procurer is thinking about, right? And so if they bring you in, they want that comfort level that you fully understand how they operate. And so what we see is a lot of firms organizing around these specialties. So whether it's, specializing by industry or it's specializing by certain delivery products, if you will, or, around certain technology, however you're doing that across your firm, we're definitely seeing firms organizing in such a way. And I think when you create these areas of specialty, business orgs or delivery units, whatever it might be, you've got to give those individual groups the ability to be flexible and creative in putting this, this team together so that they can maintain that competitive advantage when they're out there competing for their customers' business. But what we do see is, over the years, firms who have already done that, what they tended to end up having is a bunch of individual business units that ran very differently. And so when that happens, it's extremely difficult to manage the firm at the highest level when each of the individual areas are doing things in a different way. So we've really seen a change in professional services around this notion of specialization. What they understand is they've got to create a plan where they're still using common business practices across all of the areas. And as I said, you have to have that in order to be able to manage firm performance. So I've got to measure utilization the same way. I've got to measure profitability the same way. I've got to allocate my indirect overhead expenses to my projects in the same way. So in order to, to be able to do that, then allows your leadership of your firm to be able to make informed decisions. Like, for example, what's the most profitable service area right now? What are the ones that are least profitable? If they're not very profitable, should we divest of that particular practice, or could we attack that market in a different way so that we can drive up profitability? So I think the real key here is, and I think Thomas and Deborah would agree, is that common business practice has to be in place and common definition of key performance indicators while specializing.
Great. All right, so we've already talked a lot today about utilizing technology for your business. Thomas and Patrice, I'd love to hear from you guys about some of the technology that exists and how companies can understand what the technology is. Thomas, maybe you could start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's the concept that everybody hears technology, and it's a buzzword, right? There's a lot of things out there, and kind of where do you start? I think that there's a lot of organizations, specifically on the finance side, that think that a piece of technology might help do a task more efficiently. There might be cost reduction, et cetera, but they don't know really where to start. And I think my guidance on kind of where to start is always associated with high volume activities. This concept really started with shared services. So any of you guys that have a shared service center, whether it's processing invoices, answering HR-related phone calls, whatever it might be, that was really the concept of where we started to be more efficient by standardizing processes and having a group that's specialized in, whether it's conflict resolution or processing a specific task. So one of the big things that I focus on with technology is looking at where that high volume is. Is it a client-facing interaction, right? It could be, hey, we need to look at a CRM replacement, something like a Salesforce, et cetera, right? Or is it your back office? Are there inefficiencies there? So I always like to make sure that, you're really prioritizing. But when you think about where can you use it, how you can use it, where you can go to actually find it, from there, I really look at leveraging and understanding what's out there, and I always focus on disruption. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of us are, creatures of habit, and you think about why you typically gravitate towards a specific vendor or specific item, whatever it might be, it's that creature of habit concept. You know what you're going to get, and you trust what you're going to get. But I think we all can recognize, organizations like Blockbuster, Fujifilm, et cetera, right? Like some of these organizations that were at the pinnacle of kind of their market influence within their sector, and they weren't really paying attention to this a technology that was disrupting. And that's really where I focus on first is, where am I going to understand where the technology is? It's really actually looking at some of those disruptions within the market. And then from there, it's looking at really problem solving. I think the one thing, though, I always keep in mind is, some organizations look, and I mentioned this earlier about RPA and artificial intelligence and some of those, kind of buzzwords that are out in the market. And, there is a value once you hit a critical mass. So, that's the one thing that I always want to think about and have clients of ours that we work with think about is, it might sound great to use a robot to do something, whether it's a process, but there's also a critical mass, right? It still might be cheaper to leverage offshore resources to do that task or that activity. So, understanding it is great. But make sure that there's obviously, the benefit of moving towards some sort of new technology. But obviously, as I mentioned before, the goal in any sort of technology application within your organization is to eliminate those menial tasks. Get that workforce thinking, enable them to work more efficiently within professional services, any client-facing, industry where you're working a lot with clients and providing a service. The more efficient and cheaper you can be, the better service you're going to provide to obviously your customers.
Great. And Patrice, I was wondering if you might have anything to add to some of the understanding what the technology is, those sorts of issues that Thomas was talking about.
Sure, absolutely. I have spent basically my whole career helping firms deploy technology to solve those challenges or meet objectives of the firm. But I always kind of start out by saying technology doesn't solve anything unless, firms are really looking at technology coupled with people and process. That's what really brings change to the business, right? So anybody can take technology, put it in, and just recreate what they already have. And really aren't driving any value out of that. So I think, looking at it as a key pillar for sure for the future of the firm is critical, but it's got to be married with the people and the process to really drive value within the firm. And what I would say to firms, and I get to talk to firms, business and professional services firms every day, and, what I always say is you've got to challenge status quo. So what you don't want to do is maybe just modernize your technology stack because it's out of support or it's end of life, whatever it might be. You really need to challenge what you're doing as a business. Are those the right business processes? Do we have business processes that we put in due to limitations in technology? So I guess what I'm saying is kind of throw everything up in the air and really look at, what is out there in the market today? What sort of innovation can it bring into my company? And what sort of processes can we put in place to support the new way of thinking and new way of doing business. Certainly, we see firms resist the change. Things have been working for a long time, and Tom has kind of touched on this. Why fix it if it isn't broken? And I would challenge any firm to say that you may not be looking at that, but your competitors are, right? And they're looking at ways to do things in a more cost-effective manner, like Thomas mentioned, to protect the margin, or maybe to be able to deliver some sort of new game-changing services to their clients. So I guarantee, while firms that are sitting in place and saying, I don't want to touch it, I don't want to invest in that area, your competitors are. And they're, fully embracing that the technology can be a real game changer for a firm. So I love when I talk to firms, it's so refreshing when they really are embracing technology as part of their strategy going forward.
Great, thanks. So let's take a step beyond understanding just what the technology is and what's out there. Deborah, could you speak to some of the specific processes that businesses should be putting into place to effectively use these technology tools?
Sure. So we at BDO in the outsourcing practice, we rolled out our service offering called BDO Drive, and much of the 1/3 of that stool, right, a three-legged stool, is technology. And then, so the other piece are our resources and the people, and the other piece of it is that we opened up a shared service center in Columbus, Ohio. So we don't offshore any back office accounting. We keep it stateside. So when you talk about that one leg of the stool and developing a process around it, there's some really important key factors that you want to look at as you do that technology stack solutioning, right? You want to pick the pieces. And it's not going to be one size fits all because, again, there's specialization, right? So you're picking an industry that you're going to become an expert in. And a restaurant, let's say that you're specializing in restaurant, that isn't gonna, the technology associated, not all of it, will line up, let's say, if you picked healthcare, because obviously you're not going to need a point of sale system for a hospital or a healthcare organization, or vice versa. You're going to have a proprietary billing system for the healthcare industry that's HIPAA compliant. So you have to be able to understand the needs of your specialization and then select that technology to encompass it. And you don't want to fit into that one-size-fits-all. Now, there are going to be tools that you can use as standard, like accounts payable or perhaps expense reporting. So think about your ecosystem as though you put an accounting platform in the center as your hubcap, and then you do a selection of third-party applications that would complement that hubcap that sits in the middle, because you're not going to need every piece. And so we've been very specific, and we channeled ours down to 12 specific pieces of technology, knowing that some of those may change to a point that they're not a good fit and we have to select others, or we step out into a new industry and we have to add something to it. So you have to, start with what you're focused on, what that specific industry is, what the process is for that industry, so that you can make that technology selection to help you be more efficient and more automated. Because you can't know every piece of technology. It's physically, humanly impossible to be able to study and learn and select from all of these. But you can look at the marketplaces that are associated to a specific industry, and you can see technology that's been designed around those pieces. So that's, I think that's one of the best ways of developing, the process around those tools.
Thanks, Deborah. Thomas, could you speak to some strategies for keeping up with the rapidly evolving technology and all the changes, and what some of the risks for falling behind are?
Yeah, so what is it? Moore's law, right? Technology doubles every year or every year, and think about when that law was even created. It was focusing on circuits and things from a hardware perspective. So if you think about it nowadays, it's a tough task to keep up with. I think there's a couple things that I'll talk to kind of what I do personally as well, because I'm more of a tinkerer in the sense I like to know what's out there and kind of do some self-guided research in that sense. But I think the most important thing, and Deborah alluded to this, Patrice alluded to this, is that concept of specialization. Is that there's organizations, this is something that Alight does as well as a lot of other organizations, where there's a specialization around technology. And when you think about your business's core competency, you think about other businesses, their core competency is supporting organizations in technology evaluations. And so, there's the concept of making sure you have a good partner, someone that understands your industry and specializes, maybe not by industry, but by technology. So you know where to turn. So if you're looking for a new payroll application or a financial application or a professional services related billing application, there's there's companies that focus on their services to clients is providing that new data, the cutting edge technology, and giving kind of that insight to you. I always look at, kind of the IT roadmap concept. It's like fashion, right? It's never finished. It's always continually morphing and changing. So there's never a finished project. I look at technology in the same concept, that engaging a partner that understands the roadmap, what you're trying to accomplish as a business, and that can guide you is something that's very important. Personally, I love applications like LinkedIn, where there's a lot of kind of the collective sharing of my peers related to what they're looking at, what they're doing. There's also, of course, research firms that specialize in this, Gartners of the world, Bloomberg, et cetera, right, that specialize in actually getting that information out to a lot of organizations. But because I think Deborah put it perfectly, it's humanly impossible to know everything that's out there. So I think it's always good to trust someone that specializes in that. The risk of falling behind, I think it's the evolve or die concept, right? It should be a priority. I coach organizations at least once every 6 months that there is a pulse check in some capacity, depending on the organizational size and complexity. Is that a CTO? Is that a CIO? Is that analysts? It could be a variety of different ways that you can go about it. But, technology moves so quickly, and focus on that disruption, as I mentioned before, of who's really disrupting industries and making those changes, because, it's not something that's in the ever-changing workplace that we all live in that you can really afford to just sit and wait on, because you'll find yourself, quickly behind your competition and not able to actually compete with them.
Great, thanks. For our final challenge that we'd like to discuss, we're going to talk about the competitive landscape. Patrice, how has the landscape changed for professional services companies today?
Sure. Happy to take that one. So just like everything else that we've talked about in this industry, the competitive landscape is another area that creates external pressure and change in this industry. So it's really incumbent upon firms to understand what the competition is out there doing. And that landscape is always evolving and changing. So if we think about from the service delivery chain, we've got providers that have been out there for 80 years, providing services that are maybe at the lower end of the value chain that are trying to move upstream. So they're trying to get more embedded in their client and move up to more of the C-suite offices to do higher dollar value services. We've got the traditional higher value service providers moving downstream. They want to become more embedded in the day-to-day processes as well as doing the advisory work in the C-suite. So you've got movement up and down the value chain, and then you've also got coming at you from the sides these new entrants into the market. And so, a firm that just evolves very quickly and rapidly and is able to do something in a new way that the traditional providers haven't provided in that way. And we see this, in a lot of the sub-industries in professional services where essentially, a startup company is coming in and taking a piece of that service delivery and doing it in a way, using the disruptive technologies where they're able to do something in a much more cost-effective way than paying the traditional service providers to do. So it's causing firms to even have to look at deconstructing their processes and figure out where they can do things most effectively and, in a cost-effective manner for their clients. So lots of changes, and I think firms that are kind of sitting back and saying, hey, it's still business as usual, we're not changing, won't be here in 10 years, or maybe I have a very different complexion on the landscape than they have today. But the reality is, in order to compete effectively, firms have to offer more competitive pricing than they may have had to 10 years ago because of that landscape changing. And so what that means is it puts pressure on the margins that they're used to achieving, the profit margins at the service delivery level. So that then in turn is leading to firms to say, wow, if we have to offer contracts like not to exceed a certain dollar amount or what have you, we better be able to manage the work exactly according to how we spec'd it out when we offered this price to the client. So what that does, it then causes the firm to have to put in discipline. So back to that constant theme of business processes and standardization of that, that's what's going to get firms to still be able to achieve those same margins while they're not able to potentially charge the same as they used to. And then they're also having to look at creating new revenue streams. So it's a pretty exciting time, I think, in this industry, and it's really fun watching firms evolving, understanding these pressures, acknowledging them, accepting them, and saying, hey, what do we look like going forward, and what other things can we do so that we're more embedded in our clients and doing new and exciting things for them as well.
Deborah, based on some of these changes that Patrice just discussed, what are some strategies for effectively providing professional services to today's customers?
Well, I'm going to go back to what I said a little earlier, communication, right? And so, we're seeing the modeling change, quite a bit in the way of pricing, which Patrice just, referred to, that customers, clients are much, much happier with a fixed fee. They want to be able to plan and budget, especially when you go downstream with the small businesses. Their cash flow is, cash is king. And so having that fixed monthly fee sets that expectation, which is great. But what has to go alongside of that is, within the engagement, within your statement of work, you have to be very specific as to what the services are that are being provided, that is included in this fixed fee, because that's the way that it works as a win-win. The client understands what they're going to get, the communication's there, the expectation is predefined, and then when things are outside the scope, then that's beneficial from a public accounting space that you can charge for the out-of-scope things, because inevitably the client comes back with additional things that they're going to need and that they maybe didn't anticipate right from the beginning. But on top of that, when you start doing that, the cost, benefit analysis, audits, clients have to get. I mean, that's just that it's mandated by the banks. They're getting lending, and so it's hard sometimes for them to really get their hands wrapped around, the benefit of it, other than the fact that they're getting money loaned to them, or they're selling the business at a valuation, and they get that stamp of approval. And the same thing in turn goes for a tax return, right? The IRS makes us file a tax return. There isn't an exception to that rule. But this whole back office and advisory piece that you can provide as a professional services, there is a great deal of value in that. It helps the client's business grow. They're able to maybe go public or sell the company. You help them with their succession planning. You make sure you're getting your the attorneys involved. All of those things are viewed as much more beneficial and value add to clients. And so I can foresee in the next 5 years that advisory pieces of our professional service practices will be larger or equal to tax and audit added together. And that in itself falls back to the change management. You've got to be able to see what's coming. I wish we all had a crystal ball, right, and that we could see into the future. But there's the writing on the wall on, this pendulum swing that the accounting profession is going through right now. And, you have to embrace the technology with that and be able to be nimble. But again, falling back to the whole, you're communicating with your team and your staff. You're equipping them with ways to progress within the firm, get the proper training, get additional certifications that make them, more empowered to be experts in given areas. It's all of those things that you look at as far as being able to provide, that end product to the customers. I think it's, important to recognize that. And there's risk when you're doing outsourcing accounting, and BDO is extremely risk adverse. And you got to look at, cash disbursements, and if you're going to be paying your clients' bills, and, who's responsible for what, and what legal documentation do you have signed in order to protect both parties, and, are you utilizing good pieces of technology that have, been approved and gone through SOC compliant, and all of those things in order to protect the client and the firm as well.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much. We have just a few minutes here for questions from the audience. As a reminder to our attendees, feel free to submit questions via the Q&A tab that's on the right side of your screen. We've had a couple come in here. Patrice, I believe this one is directed at you. Can you talk about how firms are creating new revenue streams?
Sure. So, really one of the main areas that we see repeated in different firms is they're really looking at ways to be able to monetize their IP. So what sort of creative things can they do? They've got all this collective genius within their organization. How do you take that and then monetize it? And how do you monetize it in such a way that it's not requiring people to deliver that? It's delivered via a portal or some sort of, search engine or what have you. So I think that's probably the most common use case that we're seeing. And what's interesting is then when firms are thinking about that, they're thinking about, okay, do we, is that some sort of subscription offering or is it some sort of usage-based billing? So you can see it's exciting and it's going to create new ways of developing revenue in the organization, not associated with adding additional bodies to drive that revenue. So very, very much more higher end margin revenue, but it also, they've got to have a platform that supports that so that they can, get the invoices out the door to the customer in such a way that reflects all of the different offerings that they have for that particular client. So very interesting and a new way of thinking for us in the services industry.
Great. And Thomas, we've got a question here for you. What do you mean when you talk about the importance of a modern platform for your business?
Yeah, so, I think the kind of key simplistic, I know it's much more complicated, but the simplistic concept is technology should be an enabler, not a hindrance to your business. And I think, Patrice mentioned, I mentioned, Deborah mentioned, there's kind of the status quo, there's kind of things that you do that, are kind of working as they are, maybe not in the most efficient manner, et cetera. So, I really look at that modern kind of how quickly technology has changed, and those organizations that all they do is focus on development of new technology and how you can really use that technology to enable your business, to be more efficient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the main thing is that I look at when you're in a competitive landscape and you're up against the same competition on a regular basis, and that organization has the ability to provide better data, better analytics, or is more efficient, those cost savings are going to be passed on to eventually your buyer and that client's buyer. And I look at that concept as very integral to survive as an organization in an ever-changing landscape. And I truly do look at technology to enable that. Patrice made a great point about technology is enabled by business and process, et cetera, by the people using it. It's not simply just putting in a new piece of application. Your business, of course, needs to learn how to use it, but I look at it from that perspective. You're going to go much faster in a Ferrari than you are in a Toyota Corolla. No offense to anybody who owns a Toyota Corolla.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Deborah, one more question. This one's for you. Can you talk a little bit about security and switching to the cloud? Is it safe? How do you make sure it's safe? All of that?
Yeah, it's really funny because when I do presentations at different conferences and stuff, that question inevitably arises. Like clients will say, oh, I don't want to move to the cloud. It's not safe. But that's actually completely backwards. I mean, any IT professional will tell you you're actually safer in the cloud than you are on premise. Because even when you're on premise, the internet's connected to your computers, and having all of the security firewalls and everything around those systems on premise when you're only a small business trying to manage an IT and watch your costs isn't going to be like going to QuickBooks Online, where Intuit's already invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the securities around their systems. So I look to these, larger organizations that, maybe are public companies or that have been vetted through the compliance. There's just so many people have already switched. 90% of in the cloud is storage. So, it's an old adage that people just have to do that change in their, that change management in their head and understand that is the direction of our world, and they need to embrace it.
All right, great, thank you. So I think that we are just about out of time. Patrice, Deborah, Thomas, thank you all so much for your presentation. I hope that all of our attendees found today's discussion to be helpful and insightful. You can register for future Bloomberg Law webinars by accessing our store, which is at learning.bloombergnext.com. Please remember to fill out the webinar evaluation survey as well as confirm your certificate information. You'll receive your certificate via email when it is available. If you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email us at credits@bna.com. Finally, I just want to thank all of our speakers again for today's program, as well as Workday, who's been great to partner with for this webinar. Thank you again, and I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day.